much for being with us today. I'm Jessica Dean. Kate Baldwin is off. And we begin this hour with new evidence that the economy may be doing just fine, despite persistent fears of a recession. The U.S. government released the latest jobs report this morning, and it far exceeded what economists expected. It showed the economy adding 528,000 jobs in July. That's more than double the number analysts expected. Unemployment falling to 3.5%. And these numbers present a new complication for the Federal Reserve, which has been hoping to cool the jobs market in an effort to bring down inflation. At the same time, Senate Democrats now poised to pass a massive bill that could impact everything from the price of prescription drugs to the fight against climate change. We're going to have more on that in just a moment. We're going to start first, though, with that strong jobs report. And CNN's Matt Egan is live with us in New York. CNN's John Harwood is live at the White House. Matt, we'll start with you. Break down the numbers for us. Tell us what these numbers are showing.
Well, Jessica, this is a hot jobs market that just defied all expectations by getting even hotter. This is a remarkable figure, 528,000 jobs added in July, and basically no one saw this coming. Here's some crazy context for you. This is 200,000 jobs stronger than even the most optimistic forecaster had been predicting. And the strength was really across the board. We saw job gains in professional services, government jobs, healthcare, leisure and hospitality, all of them growing. And we also saw two major milestones that really put an exclamation point on this remarkable jobs recovery. One, the unemployment rate dropping to 3.5%. That is tied with the half-century low set before COVID. And two, payrolls have now fully recovered from the COVID recession, returning to February 2020 levels. That means all of the jobs lost during COVID have now been recovered. And I think when you put all of this together, it really undercuts the idea that the U.S. economy is already in a recession. I mean, economies that are in recession do not add 500,000 jobs in a single month. But this does make the already difficult job facing Jay Powell even harder. Because remember, the Fed is trying to actually cool the jobs market off to get inflation under control. This is exactly the opposite kind of number that the Fed was looking for. And so this does increase the pressure on the Fed to take even more aggressive steps to try to cool off inflation. And the problem is that the more the Fed does, the greater the risk of an eventual recession. Maybe not this year, but next year or 2024. So some good news on the jobs front and some less positive news, I think, on the inflation front.
That delicate balancing act that they're trying to get right. And John, I'm curious how the White House is reacting. They have to be happy to be able to say all of the jobs lost during the pandemic are back.
Well, they're delighted by this jobs report, although they acknowledge the realities that Matt Egan was just describing. Look, there's nothing a president likes more than being able to say to Americans, this is a great time to find a job. Jobs are plentiful, wages are rising. The White House also welcomes this very strong evidence that we are not in a recession. Could be next year. We're not in a recession now. Joe Biden took credit with his economic plan, that is the American Rescue Plan last year, for having fueled this solid growth and jobs recovery. But he also said, we've got work to do. We've made significant progress for American families, but we got work to do. That work that he's talking about is work on inflation. And that's the balancing act that Matt was describing. The Fed, the sweet spot here was they wanted job growth to slow. The president has talked about that himself, without falling off a cliff. Well, this is very hot. It's the opposite of slowing down. And what it is, though, is a political sweet spot, because the combination of falling gas prices and this strong jobs report, the White House at this moment, after all the political challenges of this year, they couldn't hope for better news right now.
John Harwood and Matt Egan, thanks for breaking it down for us. We appreciate it. And joining me now is CNN global economic analyst Rana Foroohar. She's also the global business columnist and the associate editor at the Financial Times. Rana, great to see you. The July report showed this economy adding 528,000 jobs last month, double as what had been predicted. What's your overall reaction to this news?
Well, honestly, Jessica, surprised. I mean, it's spot on that nobody saw this coming. I would have thought that you would have seen some growth in the service sector, in travel and tourism. It's summer. It's also important to remember this is a trailing indicator, the jobs number. So, you need to think about that when you look at where we are in the economy. But honestly, it's hard to say this is anything but a really, really strong number. You know, you've got growth across the board in almost every area. And it's a great upside surprise for the Biden administration, no question about it.
And obviously, the economy is this jigsaw puzzle they have to put together exactly right. Do these numbers make it harder for the Federal Reserve to do what it needs to do, though, to slow the economy and reduce inflation?
Well, it depends on how you define harder. I would say it makes it clearer that the Fed is going to have to continue with rate hikes in order to get this economy cooled off. And that, of course, comes with its own risks. One of the risks, and you're already seeing it today, is that the market is wary about rate hikes. Now, the stock market is not the real economy by any means, but it's worth noting that more Americans are more invested in the market today than they were in recovery cycles of the past. And so when you hike rates, you get a correction in the stock market, and that starts to affect how people feel about their finances. Also, when rates go up, you start to see the housing market go down. And that's maybe not a bad thing, because one of the things that's important to remember when you talk about recession, you know, we often talk about it in kind of wonky technical terms, but really it's about how people feel. And even though you've got a strong jobs market, you've got 5% wage growth year on year, still very strong. If you factor in inflation, if you factor in the price of housing, which is, you know, double-digit growth in the last couple of years, fuel, even though it's gone down a bit, food still high, people don't feel as strong as the labor market might indicate. And in fact, year on year, price-adjusted wages are actually down. So again, you've got to take all this into consideration when you think about where we are.
Right, all of those factors. And you mentioned recession, and that's something obviously we've all been talking about for weeks now, how it could be just around the corner. Is it here already? Does this report kind of end those concerns for this moment in time? I hear what you're saying about you have to take all the pieces together, but how does it really, what does it mean for the conversation moving forward?
Well, so I have always thought that when economists talk about recession, they speak in terms that are very technical. Recession, a technical recession is something we've already seen, 2 quarters of negative GDP growth. But the jobs market is different than GDP growth, is different than food and fuel inflation, is different than the price of housing. All of these things go into how the average consumer is feeling. And, you know, you can see in consumer sentiment reports that people feel really good about their prospects in the job market, but they feel really concerned about inflation. And the administration and the Fed are trying to walk the line of dealing with all of those things without creating a major crash in the economy. And it is a tightrope, let me tell you.
Yeah, it's a big job. All right, Rana Foroohar, thanks so much for your expertise. We sure do appreciate it. And let's go now to Capitol Hill, where Democrats are on the verge of passing a key part of President Biden's economic agenda. Democratic Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona now saying she supports the bill, and the rest of her caucus breathing a sigh of relief. CNN's chief congressional correspondent Manu Raju is live on the Hill. Manu, with Sinema on board, obviously it's looking good for Democrats. Republicans say they're going to go after that bill, though. What are you hearing?
Yeah, this morning they are laying out what their strategy is to try to derail this proposal. They have very little recourse if no Democrats defect, but they are going to try to make it as difficult as possible for Democrats when this hits the Senate floor tomorrow. After they vote to open debate, which all 50 Democrats need to do that, 50 Republicans will vote against it. The vice president could break the tie moving ahead there. Then afterwards, there'll be 10 hours of debate on each side we'll have, and then there will be a gauntlet of amendments, a series of amendments in which Republicans can offer, and Democrats too, anything they want. And Republicans plan an aggressive floor strategy to try to change the bill, scuttle the bill, and potentially convince Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, or anyone else to defect and sink this bill at the end of the day. And as what Lindsey Graham told me just moments ago, he said you can expect hell on the Senate floor.
So what will Vote-A-Rama be like? It'll be like hell. They deserve this.
These votes are going to be hard votes for the Democrats. And
So the question will be whether or not anyone will change their minds. At the moment, Democrats are confident given what happened in the last 24 hours, winning the support of Senator Kyrsten Sinema. She had objected to some of the key tax provisions in this proposal, one of which would have closed what's known as a carried interest loophole, essentially increasing taxes on hedge fund managers and private equity. Sinema got that dropped from the bill. She also had concerns about the 15% corporate minimum tax and language specifically allowing manufacturers and others to how they would depreciate their assets from their annual tax returns. She narrowed that provision to the delight of some business groups, and instead Democrats are planning to impose a 1% excise tax on stock buybacks, in which they're promising this ultimately will save $300 billion in the budget over the next 10 years, but still some road from hurdles to overcome, even as Democrats are closer to making this bill into law. Jessica.
Absolutely. They're back in tomorrow at noon. Some weekend work for the Senate there. Manu, Raju, thanks so much. New fallout from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's controversial visit to Taiwan. China now suspending cooperation with the U.S. on a range of issues critical to both countries and to the world. CNN's Natasha Bertrand is live in Washington with the latest on this. Natasha, what are the details?
Yeah, Jessica, so a serious escalation of tensions here as the White House and China go back and forth in response to that controversial visit by Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan. We're learning this morning that the U.S. did summon the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. to the White House in order to give him basically a dressing down in response to China's major provocations near Taiwan over the last several days. China has, of course, launched a number of missiles near Taiwan. They have launched a number of fighter jets that have gone into Taiwanese airspace. And importantly, they actually crossed that median line, that halfway point between Taiwan and China that has been seen in the past as kind of a red line that China and Taiwan were not supposed to cross. So a serious escalation here. And we're learning that the U.S. reiterated to the Chinese ambassador that this is not unprecedented. The visit by Pelosi was not unprecedented, and that the U.S.'s one China policy, which states that Taiwan is not independent from China, really has not changed here. But what is unprecedented is the level of military provocations that we have seen from China. So the U.S. seeking to make clear here that nothing has changed on their end, but at the same time, they will not be deterred from operating in the Western Pacific as they have been for many decades. Jess.
All right, Natasha Bertrand for us. Thanks so much for that update. We appreciate it. And new this morning, Russia now says it's ready to discuss a prisoner swap with the U.S. in private. It's now been 24 hours since a Russian court sentenced WNBA star Brittany Griner to 9 years in prison for a drug offense. CNN's Kylie Atwood is live at the State Department. Kylie, what are the details of this potential swap?
Well, listen, this was a potential swap that the Biden administration put on the table back in June. And what they proposed was putting on the table Victor Boot. His nickname is the Merchant of Death. He is a convicted arms dealer. He's serving a 25-year prison sentence here in the United States. And the Biden administration offered to send him back to Russia in return for getting back Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan. Now, the problem being that the Russians came back through some secret channels and actually made a counteroffer saying that they wanted another Russian added to the list. That Russian is actually serving a lifelong prison sentence in Germany for murder right now. So the Biden administration said that wasn't a serious counteroffer. So those conversations weren't exactly productive. What we're watching for now is if they can come back to a place where they're having productive conversations over this. And there does appear to be some momentum in that direction, with Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia saying that the Russians are ready to discuss this matter through the channels, through the framework that was established when the two presidents, President Biden and President Putin, met last summer, and the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, saying that the Biden administration is going to pursue that. So we're watching to see where this goes. Jess?
Yeah, we'll see how that develops. All right, Kylie Atwood at the State Department. Thanks so much. Now to the trial of right-wing conspiracy theorist Alex Jones. A new phase in his defamation trial is now underway in Austin, Texas. Jurors will now consider awarding punitive damages to the parents of Sandy Hook first grader Jesse Lewis. They say that they've received death threats and were harassed because of Jones' repeated false claims that the school shooting was a hoax. The jury ordered the InfoWars radio show host to pay $4.1 million in compensatory damages And jurors could award even more in today's phase of the trial. Some exclusive CNN reporting. Donald Trump's legal team is talking with the Justice Department regarding its January 6th criminal probe. Sources telling CNN those talks are focused on executive privilege issues, specifically whether or not Trump can shield conversations he had as president from federal prosecutors. In a statement to CNN, a spokesperson for the former president said, quote, there is clearly a concerted effort to undermine the vital, constitutionally rooted executive and attorney-client privileges through partisan political persecution. This just the latest sign the DOJ's investigation is accelerating and turning its focus to the former president. CNN learned this week the DOJ issued subpoenas for Trump's former White House counsel and his deputy. And as the investigation has progressed, sources say Trump is being told to cut ties with some of his former staff, including his former chief of staff, Mark Meadows. But Trump, according to sources, has so far ignored that advice. CNN is now hearing from the vice chair of the January 6th committee, Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney, sitting down with CNN's Casey Hunt to talk about where the investigation is going, including whether Donald Trump will be allowed to run again in 2024.
Do you think that the Biden Justice Department is going to stop him from becoming president again?
I think that the Justice Department is going to follow the facts and the evidence. I think that they clearly seen significant activity in terms of, the individuals that they now have testifying in front of the grand jury in D.C. And I think they're taking their obligation seriously. I think we've certainly seen in our hearings when you have the former Attorney General, former White House counsel, former acting Attorney General, former Deputy Attorney General, when you have individuals who served Donald Trump, who were nominated by him and who served at the highest levels, who have testified in front of the committee and made clear, for example, as did Pat Cipollone, that President Trump didn't want people to leave the Capitol. Now, Mr. Cipollone made that point, trying to protect executive privilege, but I don't think anybody had any doubt what he was saying. And so I think the Justice Department is, from what I can tell from the outside, committed to following the facts and following the evidence, and they're taking it seriously.
Some have expressed concern that prosecuting former President Trump would turn him into a martyr and potentially add to his political strength with a base that follows him pretty rapidly. Do you share that concern? Do you have any concern that a prosecution would strengthen Donald Trump's political hand?
I don't think that it's appropriate to think about it that way, because the question for us is, are we a nation of laws? Are we a country where no one is above the law? And what do the facts and the evidence show? And certainly, I've been very clear. I think he's guilty of the most serious dereliction of duty of any president in our nation's history. You've had a federal judge in California say that it's more likely than not that he and John Eastman committed two crimes. So, I think that we're going to continue to follow the facts. I think the Department of Justice will do that, but they have to make decisions about prosecution, understanding what it means if the facts and the evidence are there and they decide not to prosecute. How do we then call ourselves a nation of laws? I think that's a very serious balancing.
It sounds like you think that the evidence is there and that if they don't follow that evidence, that's a dereliction of duty on their part.
Well, the committee has been, I think, very thorough in laying out much of what we know. There's much more that we have not yet shared in hearings and that we anticipate we will share in the fall. But, and we will also make decisions about criminal referrals. And ultimately, the decision about prosecution is up to the Justice Department, but I would anticipate that the committee will have an opinion on that.
CNN is reporting that the Pentagon texts from January 6th are missing. This is, of course, after the Department of Homeland Security and the Secret Service seem to have lost texts. Do you think there was malicious intent behind the Pentagon's deletion of texts related to that day?
I don't know that that's the case. I haven't seen evidence of malicious intent. I do think, though, that it's concerning that you have text messages, apparently, and this is based on the news reporting, but text messages apparently of some of the senior officials, people like Kash Patel, apparently not available. Now, certainly as a committee, we'll get to the bottom of that. We've been working with Secret Service in a situation has been reported where text messages are not available or were erased off of phones. But we've received hundreds of thousands of documents from the Secret Service and significant information from them that the committee is going through and will use in our investigation and as we conduct interviews of additional Secret Service agents.
How much would you say you have learned that was unexpected? I mean, you obviously have a lot more information than the general public does in your head about what happened that day. But when you started these hearings earlier this year, did you have any idea how much you would know by this point?
It's been more information and a more sophisticated and broader reaching effort than I understood coming into it. I think all of us on the committee have had that same reaction, which is that there was so much more that was happening in multiple different areas, whether it was the pressure on state officials or the pressure on the Justice Department or the attempt to corruptly pressure the vice president himself. So I think that the volume of information has been more than I expected, and certainly I obviously came into this very concerned, and the information itself has not lessened my concern at all.
Are you in contact with the former Vice President, Mike Pence, as you're learning this new information?
No, we've had discussions with his counsel, obviously, about his interactions with the committee, but not with him personally.
What's your assessment of how he's handling potentially running for president? Because he's out there kind of opposing the former president, but unlike you, he's not out there criticizing former President Trump.
What I would say is that Vice President Pence was a hero on January 6th, and that it's very clear that there was tremendous pressure from a number of different places on him, and he did his duty, and he didn't succumb to that pressure. And if he had succumbed to that pressure, things would have been very different. And so I think that we owe him gratitude for how he conducted himself and for his refusal to do what Donald Trump wanted him to do, which would have been illegal and unconstitutional.
Do you think he'd be an ally in the fight to keep Trump out of the Oval Office?
Let me just leave it where I did. I think that his actions on January 6th are ones for which the nation should be grateful.
There's been a lot of speculation about how the committee is or isn't making an impact with the American people, especially when it comes to this question of whether Donald Trump becomes the Republican nominee and eventually potentially president of the United States again. Do you think the committee's work is moving the needle politically?
I don't think about it that way. I think about it more because I think it's important that the committee's work not be viewed through a political lens, and that's not how I think about that. I think about it in terms of whether or not we're reaching people who understand how serious the threat was and continues to be. And I think in that regard, we have done a job that I'm proud of.
Do you think there are enough people out there in the country who share these concerns that you have and that many people who were also at the Capitol on that day have? Are there enough Americans out there to move the needle?
I think that the vast majority of Americans understand how important it is that we have peaceful transitions of power, and that at the heart of who we are as Americans and at the heart of our republic is a peaceful transition of power. And no matter what your party affiliation is, you have to have a president who will guarantee that. And Donald Trump did not. And so I do think that as more and more facts become known, people are paying attention and understanding how serious the threat is.
And CNN's Casey Hunt joins me now. Casey, Liz Cheney is facing a primary later this month, and her opponent is endorsed by Donald Trump. What are her chances, and what does she think that means for her career?
So honestly, Jessica, her chances aren't very good, and the Cheney team knows that. I mean, the Republican Party in Wyoming has really moved away from where Liz Cheney and, of course, her father, Dick Cheney, who just cut an ad for his daughter in this race, sit. And I think that Cheney, and she's pretty explicit with me about this as well, she sees losing this race as something she's willing to sacrifice. Because she thinks it's so important to stand up and tell the truth about the election as she's been doing. So, of course, the challenge for her is staying on the national stage in the event that she does lose. She will be the vice chairman of the committee as long as the committee exists, at least through the end of the year. We expect Republicans to take over the House of Representatives and the entire committee likely to be disbanded. She, of course, if she does lose her seat, that's about the same time she would be leaving Congress as well. So, there's some real challenges ahead for her in staying part of this conversation, Jessica.
Yeah, no doubt about it. All right, Casey Hunt, great interview. Thanks so much. And just a reminder, you can see more of Casey's interview.
The U.S. says it will pursue Russia's offer to discuss a prisoner swap, that offer coming after WNBA star Brittany Griner was sentenced to 9 years yesterday in a Russian prison. Griner pled guilty to smuggling a small amount, about a gram, of cannabis oil into Russia earlier this year. This morning, Trevor Reed, a U.S. Marine veteran who served nearly 3 years in a Russian prison before his release earlier this year, spoke to CNN about the conditions there.
Food there is terrible. Sometimes that could be just some fish bones or broth of fish bones, potato soup with, it's mostly water. Solitary confinement there is basically consists of just a concrete room with a hole in the floor for a toilet. Just really middle-aged looking stuff.
And that's just harrowing conditions to hear from someone who experienced it himself. CNN senior international correspondent Fred Pleitkin is in Moscow. Fred, the U.S., as you know, suggested a prisoner swap before Griner's sentencing. Russia kind of anteed up. Do you find the statement now a sign that substantive negotiations will begin again?
Well, it certainly appears as though there is some movement, at least, Jim. And I think, first of all, you're absolutely right. The Russians were extremely irritated when the U.S. came out and publicly said that there was a substantial offer on the table to try and get both Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan out of Russian custody, a swap. And it's something that the Russians really didn't want to talk about publicly. They called it megaphone diplomacy. They said that the U.S. needed to return to quiet diplomacy. It seems as though there are some changes to that now with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. They're publicly saying that Russia is willing to engage. And one of the things that Brittany Griner's lawyers told us throughout this trial is that they believe that there needed to be a verdict in this trial and a sentencing in this trial for some sort of prisoner swap to actually happen. Now, of course, that is something that we have, even though there is going to be an appeals process going on. The legal team telling me that they are going to file an appeal against this verdict. And so while we probably won't, or we definitely won't see it in public, it looks as though negotiations can possibly go into another gear now. It was interesting today, though, that the spokesman for the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, he came out and he said that these negotiations can take place, but none of the details can ever become public. He said that if details of negotiations about prisoner swaps in general become public, even some details, then those swaps simply are not going to happen. So looking forward to all this moving to behind closed doors. And we heard Secretary of State Blinken also, who was in Cambodia today, saying that they are going to pursue this through the avenues that are in place and going to be taking up that offer from the Russians.
All right, we'll be watching closely. Fred Pleitkin, thanks so much. Sure, joining me now to discuss is Jared Genser. He's an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown and a human rights attorney who specializes in representing Americans held by foreign governments. He's represented Nobel Peace Prize laureates Desmond Tutu and Elie Wiesel. His current clients include two Americans imprisoned in Iran. Jared, good to have you on this morning.
Thanks for having me.
So you got a lot of experience dealing with governments who hold Americans, often governments who use their judiciary to create hostages like we're seeing, like these circumstances have been described in Russia. First, your read of that statement this morning from the Kremlin spokesman, is that a sign to you that talks are happening again between the U.S. and Russia?
You know, it is a sign of a willingness to engage, but ultimately Vladimir Putin wants to extract a very high price. And so while we all hope and pray that Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan can be brought home soon, I don't yet see this as a sign that a deal is imminent and going to happen immediately. We'll have to see how it plays out, but these kinds of negotiations can definitely take time.
Was it a mistake, in your view, for the Biden administration to go public with the offer that they had made? Granted, their argument was they made it and Russia was really not responsive. Do you think that inflamed the situation?
I mean, obviously the Kremlin will position itself however it wants. I mean, at the end of the day, when it comes to these kinds of exchanges, when the price is right, the state detaining an American will cut the deal. So to me, it's a bit of a sideshow in terms of the public diplomacy there. At the end of the day, the United States is trying to force the issue and to move it forward, and ultimately we have to see whether Vladimir Putin will play ball.
You've made the point that there really needs to be some sort of multilateral response to address this broader phenomenon, because it's not just Russia that's done this. Iran has done it. I've covered them, and I know you've represented clients there. You take in Americans, you accuse them of either a non-existent crime or a trumped-up crime. You give them a massive sentence, and then you say, what are you going to give me in return? So what's your suggestion for how the U.S. and its partners can kind of push back against this phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the biggest mistake that we as a country have made, really began at the beginning of the modern era of hostage taking, which was the takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in '79. And since then, Republican and Democratic presidents have repeatedly cut deals on a kind of one country, one prisoner at a time basis, which only creates greater incentives for hostage taking. And so what I'm proposing is a multilateral agreement where like-minded countries in the world would come together and announce that there would be draconian consequences that they would take both bilaterally and multilaterally in the case of this kind of pattern of hostage taking that takes place by a state. At the end of the day, the only way to end hostage taking of Americans is to go right to the heart of the value of the whole proposition, which is elevating the cost dramatically above the benefits of taking hostages.
That's so a follow question. Are you saying that by making these deals, you create incentives, you incentivize the taking of the next hostage?
I mean, I think the answer is yes. Quite clearly that happens. I represent the American hostages in Iran, Siamak and Bakhar Namazi. Siamak Namazi was the only American left behind in January 2016 when Obama cut the nuclear deal and kind of inexplicably left Siamak Namazi behind. Rather than him getting out in a number of weeks, which is what the Iranians claimed they were going to do, then his dad was taken hostage. And now we're 2,500 days after Siamak Namazi was taken into custody, almost 7 years, and he still remains in Tehran's Evin prison.
Final question, if we can. This sentence yesterday, 9.5 years, clearly sending a message, 9 years, I should say, sending a message to the U.S., to Griner, to others. Having had the sentence now, and it's public, and it's an international headline, does that, in your view, make it more likely that Russia will be willing to deal? In other words, they've made their point. I mean, again, similar to what you've sometimes seen in Iran with someone like Roxana Saberi, right? Give the big sentence and then make a deal.
Yeah, I mean, the Russians have said, and it works the same way in our system as well, that until there was a conviction and sentence, that they weren't going to be prepared to make a deal. It doesn't have to work that way. I mean, in any case, in any country in the world, a prosecutor could just decide at any point to drop a case even before a conviction and sentence happens. But this is how it has worked in Russia before. So it's not a surprise that this is what they were saying. It put Brittany Griner into an impossible situation where, the conviction rate in the Russian courts is like 99.5%. And so she was, I think, really compelled, induced to plead guilty in order to not have this process play out forever. But again, that's no guarantee the Russians will play ball. We're really just going to have to wait to see.
Just quickly, for folks watching now, should they feel confident, hopeful that Brittany Griner will gain her freedom long before that 9-year sentence is up?
Yeah, I mean, I would be shocked if she would serve anything close to that. But, I don't see it being resolved in the next couple of weeks. I think we're talking probably many months at a minimum. And, I think, the last thing I'll just note is that this multilateral approach that I'm talking about, I think, is going to be especially important. You know, the president's going to have to cut a deal that of course, everybody's going to criticize him for. You know, when you're talking about trading Americans for people who, for example, were convicted of killing Americans, that doesn't go over well. But pivoting to that, which is something that Secretary Blinken at the State Department has just begun to kind of work on, and I believe is strongly supportive of, is really going to be a way to end modern day hostage taking.
Jared Genser, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Coming up, a CNN